Hi, my name's Chris Thomas and welcome to DVD 4 in our series on particle flow fundamentals, which is tests, forces and collisions. In this DVD we're going to look at three more areas of particle flow. Those areas are tests, which can be used as a way of controlling the flow of our particles from one event to another, forces and force space warps, which can be used to create the illusion of real-world physics forces on our particles, and finally collision tests and collision space warps, which are used to detect when a particle comes into contact with a surface, allowing them to rebound and also to be passed on to another event within the flow. Each of these areas is very important when working with particles. Tests allow us to give our particles some kind of logic. We can decide when and if they are going to be passed to a new event, and in this way change their shape, make them move faster, make them explode, or indeed remove them from the scene if that's what we want to do. Just as important are forces, which can be used to choreograph our particles to perform in a certain manner, or to fall under gravity or be blown by the wind and so on. And finally, with collisions, we have a way of making our particles interact with the rest of our scene. Or collisions can be used as a general test to work out when particles pass from one area of a scene to another. So, as you can see, there's a lot of power within these three topics. Let's quickly run through the running order of this DVD, and I'll give you a quick description of each chapter. In the first chapter on age test, we have a look at the age test, which actually tests our particle for their age, and you have various ways of doing that. In the second chapter, we look at the collision test, and here we actually skip on to collision tests, which is in a separate section of the DVD. And in this area, we actually look at the collision test itself, and we run through the various parameters for it and how those work. Then we have a look at the deflectors that actually work with the collision test, and we first look at the basic deflectors, and then we go on to have a look at the omni deflectors, which is another type of deflector with more parameters. Then we go back into our normal run and we look at the collision spawn test, which is related to the collision test. We then look at the find target test, which is a way of actually getting our particles to head towards an object, and when they reach that object you can actually have them test true. We then look at the go to rotation test, which is a test that can actually rotate your particles around to a certain orientation within a certain time period or within other criteria, and when they reach that rotation they test true and get sent on to a new test. Then we look at the scale test, which obviously works out the size of our particles, and if they reach a certain criteria they test true. We look at the script test, which is a very, very flexible test, and we run through some examples of how that can be used there. We look at the send out test, which is a kind of dummy test in a way, because it actually just sends particles out to a new event. The only other option you have there is to actually not send out particles. We then look at the spawn test, part of which functionality we actually looked at earlier in our collision spawn test. And the spawn test basically creates new particles from a single particle, and is very useful for doing things like explosions and water and sprays of various kinds. We then look at the speed test, which can use various definitions of speed to actually work out whether your particles test true for the test. You can work on acceleration, deceleration, speed, speed in any one of the axes, and so on. We then look at the three related tests, the first of which is the split amount test, and that actually just works out a proportion of particles to send on to the next event. We have the second test in the series, which is the split selector test, and that will actually only take selected particles and send them on to the next event. And then we have the last of the three, and that is the split source test, and that will actually take particles from only one source in our flow and send them on to the next test. From here we then go on to have a look at the forces, and we first look at the gravity force space warp, and that obviously mimics gravity as we see it in the real world. We then look at the wind space warp, which as you can imagine produces an effect close to wind in the real world, and also gives us the ability to apply turbulence to our objects. We then look at drag, which is a very useful space warp in that it actually slows down our particles and takes energy out of them, and is very useful in any particle system for stopping your particles getting extremely fast or agitated and so on. We have vortex, which is an interesting force, but not necessarily that useful because it's very hard to control, and as you can tell by its name, it's actually used for producing vortices like tornadoes and water spouts and so on. Then we have three related forces in that they can actually be used to actually recreate, to a certain extent, the forces seen in the vortex space warp. Those are the particle bomb, which is generally designed to actually produce an explosion effect on our particles, but with different settings can actually be used as a cylindrical gravity, a spherical gravity, and so on. We have the motor space warp, which is actually a force which causes our particles to rotate around its central axis. And we have the push space warp, which actually just pushes particles in one direction. And as I said, if you use P-bomb, motor and push together, you can actually recreate pretty much all of the functionality and more of the vortex space warp. And finally, to finish off on the DVD, before going to the conclusion, we have a look at script wiring, which is the ability to actually assign values to the float channel of our particles, and then pick that up in the actual force operator and have that affect how much of that force is actually applied to the particle. Okay, we have a lot of ground to cover on this DVD, so let's get on with it and start with the test operators.